Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Center for the Study of World Religions. I'm Charles Stang. We are here for the second of our two back-to-back events celebrating our colleague, Professor Elliot Wolfson, whom the CSWR is privileged to host this academic year as a visiting scholar in Jewish studies, mysticism, and philosophy of religion. So some of us have had a long afternoon, including Professor Wolfson. So there is sustenance in the back corner, sadly not for those of you who are online, but please feel free to help yourself there. So we've just concluded a book seminar on Professor Wolfson's most recent book, Nocturnal Seeing, with responses from Professors Bettina Bergo and Shaul Magid. And we're delighted to welcome Professor Elliot to this podium to give a lecture on his new monograph entitled, or the lecture is entitled, the monograph is entitled Unveiling Veils of Infinitivity. Did I get that right? I did. Philosophic and Kabbalistic Ruminations on Apophasis and Envisioning the Invisible. So I'm sure most of you here already know who Professor Wolfson is, but nevertheless a very brief introduction. He received his Bachelor and Master's of Arts degree from Queens College of the City University of New York, where he pursued the study of philosophy, focusing especially on phenomenology, hermeneutics, and existentialism. He received a Master of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy degrees from Brandeis University, where he specialized in the study of Kabbalistic texts and traditions that have remained central to his work. He was the Abraham Lieberman Professor of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at NYU from 1987 until 2014, whereupon he moved to the Marcia and J. Glazer Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's also a Fellow of the American Academy of Jewish Research and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In this evening's lecture, Professor Wolfson will argue that infinity and apophasis intersect at the vanishing point where the human mind reaches its limit by confronting the limitlessness that can be described only as indescribable. Quote, "To speak of the nothing of infinity is a far greater challenge than to have nothing of which to speak. If the cessation of speech is the goal of the mystical path that culminates in cogitating the nature of infinity beyond comprehension and linguistification, then muteness would be the appropriate response. But in fact, the way of the mystic demands the much more difficult task of speaking the unspeakable." Thank you again, all of you, for joining us. Professor Wolfson, the floor is yours.
I'm going to repeat again my gratitude to Professor Stang for facilitating my year here as a fellow. It's been a great opportunity to return to Cambridge and to Harvard. So thank you for that, and also thank you for organizing these events, and thank you all for coming. So, one other thing. I want to thank Ashley, who this morning put this together for me, and also had the keen creative wisdom to include some images of my paintings. So I don't know if you like any of them, but you get the opportunity to not just listen to my paradoxical language, but look at some of the paradoxical images. But actually, before I begin, I did want to start with a somewhat more personal reflection, as this will likely be, at least for this year, my last presentation here at the center. So being in Cambridge at this stage of my life, after I officially retired from close to 40 years of teaching, has really filled me with a deep sense of nostalgia. And mostly, I suppose, because I spent my days as a graduate student I went to Brandeis, but I lived here in Cambridge. Well, Somerville and then Cambridge. And that was a period of time when, to borrow Huxley's expression, the doors of perception were being opened up. And I won't elaborate further, but part of those doors were being opened by my intricate involvement with the study of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and the occult. So in a book called Suffering Time, which came out in 2021, I reflected on the commonly used expression lifetime. And I put it this way: it is a conjunction that displays a juxtaposition that is elemental to our way of being in the world. What most impresses our thinking about the life that is passing is the passing that is life. A passing that lies at the root of our rootlessness, ensuing from the fact that we are cast inescapably in the mold of temporal beings, whose fate it is to assume the mantle of always being in time for the time being. But why nostalgia? So this is a kind of bridge between the two presentations today. In a letter to Yaakov Taubes, written on January 2nd, 1951, Susan Taubes traced the term nostalgia etymologically to two Greek words, nostos, to return home, and algos, pain. From this philological observation, we can extrapolate the philosophical insight that the nostalgic hankering to go back home is always fraught with the agony of the disjuncture between the ego, recounting the plot line, and the temporality with which it is identified. On the one hand, nostalgia disrupts the very continuity it seeks to establish between past and present, testifying to the impossibility of a complete narrativization of the self. On the other hand, nostalgia imparts that the goal of existence must not be to live in the past, but rather to drag the past into the present as an inherent part of the future. I hope this lesson will continue to light the path going forward, but I suspect the journey will require new feet. As I wrote in a poem long ago, which coincidentally was called Nostalgia, where does one walk to buy new feet? So once again, I thank everyone for coming, and I hope it will be worth your while. So now we'll turn to the lecture at hand, which you see is called Infinity at the Perimeter of Thought, Silence at the Edge of Language. So this is, what I'll present tonight is pretty much drawn from the foreword and introduction to the book that one draft has been finished, but I'm still working on it. And you heard the title from Charles's presentation. So let me begin then. If postmodernism has taught us anything, it has taught us that God and the devil still reside in the details. To state the obvious, in the current academic environment, we are hypersensitive to the peril of offering generalizations that would compromise the intricacies of the particular. Recourse to transcendental truths or metaphysical absolutes is considered essentializing and totalizing, and thus in the final analysis, any juridical decision we arbitrate can only be a judgment of non-judgment. To use a Kabbalistic trope, in an age inundated by heterogeneity and disjointedness, all we have are fragments of broken vessels. But even this metaphor must be modified. In contradistinction to the Kabbalists, we do not readily accept that the fragments originate from or may be reassembled into a retrievable totality. Ever mindful of the limits of our analytical categories, conceptual framings, and synthetic reconstructions, what we can lay claim to at best are fragments of a fragmentation that cannot be rendered whole, the breaking of a brokenness that cannot be unbroken. Indeed, the challenge before us is not the meaninglessness, dread of meaninglessness, but the terror of a surplus of meaning in whatever we study, a superfluity for which we could never give an adequate reckoning. In the language of Derridian dissemination, the supplement may prove to be as essential as what we imagine supplementarily to be essential. The better part of valor, accordingly, should summon humility and the aporetic suspension of certitude on the part of the scholar. The investigation of apophasis and infinity, I have undertaken mandates of displacement of the traditional binary logic. A is either P or not P, but not both P and not P at the same time and in the same relationship. Or to invoke Derrida again, and this will be the first text, what is required is the opening of the square, the supplementary for, neither a crossed nor a closed square, the more or less which disjoins dissemination from polysemy. Leaving aside the association that Derrida made between this process and castration, what is noteworthy is the discernment that the deprivation of certainty is more formidable and tenacious than the polysemic avowal of multiple meanings. That is, in the end, the only meaningfulness is that there is no meaning, and agnosticism casts geometrically in the figure of the square, so open that the fourfold is no longer determinative of the indissoluble shape of squareness. Hermeneutically, the supplement is, this is again Derrida's language, a false mirror that pushes the labyrinth's infinity back forever in mind. That is endless speculation. If the nature of infinity is such that it must be pushed backward endlessly by the human mind in its unyielding finiteness, then there is no end to envision that is not always and therefore never ending. This is surely the case when the focal point of contemplation is the ostensibly impenetrable intersection of the apophatic and the infinite. The study of mysticism presents an additional complication, insofar as the experiences investigated under this rubric are typically thought to deal with matters difficult, if not impossible, to classify and to analyze on account of their ineffability and inscrutability. Like many other scholars of my generation, I reject the assumption that we can posit a rigid definition of mysticism, an essence that would be applied unqualifyingly, insisting instead that any taxonomy of this phenomenon must be gauged from the perspective of sociocultural and historical context, allocating precedence to the inimitability of the particular. As Sholem famously argued in the introductory lecture of Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, and you see it on the screen, there is no such thing as mysticism in the abstract. That is to say, a phenomenon or experience which has no particular relation to other religious phenomena. There is no mysticism as such, there is only the mysticism of a particular religious system, Christians, Islamic, Jewish mysticism, and so on. So this has famously become the cornerstone of what's called the contextualist or constructivist argument. But Sholem did not deny the legitimacy of studying mystical experiences comparatively. His point rather is that it is misguided to isolate those experiences from the mystic's communal and individual identity. Building on Sholem's analyses, I've argued that the viability of a comparative orientation rests on the belief that the universalizable facet of mystical experience is its inherent formlessness. Paradoxically, the lack of essence is what allows one to speak of an essence. The essence, that is, consists of there being no essence. The point has been reaffirmed more recently by Jess Hollenbach. You can see that on the screen. It should now be clear that when one says that mystical experience is amorphous, this is simply another way of stating that one can never isolate either its content or its effects from the mystic's historical context. Indeed, the content of almost every mystical experience seems to be structured in such a manner as to empirically validate or otherwise legitimize many elements of that description of reality that are either expressly or implicitly present in the mythologies, dogmas, or rituals that form the core of that religious tradition to which the mystic adheres. The effort to strike a balance between essence and context is buttressed by the surmise of neuroscientists that what appears to be hypothetically homogeneous turns out to be experimentally heterogeneous. And here I cite one example from Minding the Brain, A Guide to Philosophy and Neuroscience, where Georg Nordhoff observed that we cannot assume that there is one homogeneous function called memory. Instead, the concept of memory must be considered an umbrella concept that covers heterogeneity of different functions and processes associated with different neural mechanisms and regions on the brain. I see no reason to doubt the validity of this claim, but it still seems indefensible to maintain that heterogeneity is discernible only against the backdrop of homogeneity. Indeed, the cerebral processing of information precludes positioning the two in dyadic opposition. We could not mentally recognize experiential variation without postulating ideational uniformity. Brushing against the grain, I would submit that to circumvent the equally problematic methodological extremes of essentializing the context or contextualizing the essence, one must occupy the middle, excluded by the law of the excluded middle, that has had a profound impact on Western modes of speculative reasoning and empirical research. Political correctness notwithstanding, to declare absolutely that there are no absolutes smacks of a self-contradictory posture that is no less dogmatic in its alleged dismissal of dogmatism than the evidently dogmatic claim that there are absolutes available to human discernment. Lest there be any misunderstanding, let me state unequivocally that I am not advocating the need to reclaim either an ontological or an epistemological foundationalism. My point rather is that perspectivism cannot be cogently affirmed without negating itself, since the truth that there is no truth but from a particular perspective should itself be subject to the very criterion of perspective. Philosophers have long noted that the relativist stance ensnares one in the ironic trap of Pyrrhonian skepticism. To state categorically that truth is unattainable can be true only if it is false, but it can be false only if it is true. To affirm that there is no truth, therefore, is to utter an absurd proposition, as the coherence of the utterance depends on the denial of what is uttered. As Emmanuel Levinas put it in Reflections on the Philosophy of Hitlerism, as published in 1934, the structure of thought and truth in the West is characterized by the distance that ineludibly separates the human subject from the world of ideas in which that subject will choose his or her truth. This is what brands the person free and alone in the face of the world, now quoting Levinas, to the point of being able not to cross the distance and not to make a choice. Skepticism, therefore, is not only the basic possibility for the Western spirit, that's what Levinas was arguing, but it is that which allows one to retain one's freedom, such that the future negation is already brewing within the affirmation to which one has committed oneself. This freedom constitutes thought's dignity, but also its danger, inasmuch as deceit insinuates itself in the gap that separates consciousness from the world of ideas. Although inviolably bound to the truth that there is no inviolable truth, I nonetheless acknowledge the inherently conflictual and subversive repercussions of the relativism that prevails in academic discourse, and the heterodoxy of the historicizing hermeneutic that has become its own orthodoxy. If meaning is always to be determined from context, then the veracity of this assertion and the methodological postulate that proceeds therefrom cannot be sufficiently generalized to justify the argument for contextualization. Simply put, without the ability to step out of context, we could not cultivate the cognitive apparatus necessary to detect the parameters of any context. So based on these considerations, I would argue that it remains theoretically warranted and heuristically viable to ponder the sundry iterations of the mystical in different settings by identifying recurring patterns of thought that cohere in unified systems of multidimensional meaning. I hasten to add that these patterns can be compared profitably to DNA, which generates new molecular constellations in an apparently ceaseless cycle of succession, the infinite genetic variation, while the systems provide the relatively stable frameworks through and in which those fluctuating cellular patterns evolve, dissolve, and revolve. Even though we embrace the postmodern suspicion regarding meta-narratives ascribed to a meta-subject, and the crisis of metaphysical philosophy implied thereby in the formulation of Lyotard, we are compelled nevertheless to engage the problem of the viability of system in evaluating the various ways that we strive to know the world. Thinking in the footsteps of Franz Rosenzweig, I would proffer that system does not denote an architectural structure formed by assembling individual stones whose meaning is validated by the postulation of a totality that remains intact, but rather the striving on the part of each individual for co-relationality with all the other individuals. The merit of a system so conceived, therefore, is dependent on fabricating a unity incessantly in the making, concocting a cohesiveness that displays an impulse for order that can be realized only through negotiating, but never abolishing the chaos. Contrary to the Hegelian dialectic, we may have some disagreement on this, that envisages a universal instantiated comprehensively in the particular, what we might call a singular universality, we do better to think of the universal as being configured continually in light of the random and indiscriminate particular, the universal singularity. A universal that is, to borrow the formulation of Jean-Luc Nancy, always calibrated from the perspective of, quote, being with one another, circulating in the width and as the width of the singularity, singularly plural coexistence, a universal that must be reckoned from the obdurate contingency of the individual. Okay. Phenomenologically, the systematicity of the open system, if we want to call it that, or perhaps the systemless system, whose consistency of necessity will be its inconsistency, is an order without a center, within which the particulars harmoniously coalesce. We can speak cybernetically of the hypersystem, in which the compartmentalization of the parts cannot be reductively subsumed under the aggregation of the whole, nor the aggregation of the whole under the compartmentalization of the parts. The incoherence of the non-systematic, therefore, is the metric of the coherence of the systematic, whence it follows that the limitless complexity of the plurivocality of the singular delimits the parameters of the limited simplicity of the univocity of the accumulated sum. What is most pertinent for our purposes is that the irrational should be regarded as the complementary constituent of the rational, in the same manner that the non-conceptual is conceptualized unfailingly as an aspect of the conceptual. The semblance of coherence issues not from a single underlying principle of rationality, but from the diverging viewpoints converging in our imaginary representations of the virtual as real. I would suggest that it is precisely this factor that substantiates the study of mysticism, and I might add the study of religion more generally, in a cross-cultural perspective. The objective is not to level out difference in the guise of some ill-conceived and antiquated notion of sameness, but to engender the sense of sameness by probing deeper into the ground of difference. It is a posit to recall Nietzsche's adage that seeing things as similar and making things the same is the sign of weak eyes. The stronger vision is undoubtedly one that can perceive the congruence of the parallel through the facade of the incongruent. Any attempt to reify a phenomenon as multifaceted as the idea of infinity, disseminated in the Kabbalah, which brings us back to the point of this lecture, by identifying an essential core, is dubious, and runs the risk of what Alfred North Whitehead called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, that is, obfuscating the intricacy of the concrete nature of an actual entity when it is considered merely from the abstract perspective of a category of thought that proffers a false sense of completeness. Based on the metaphysical contention regarding the complexity of nature, Whitehead was critical of a scientific methodology that aims at seeking the simplest explanation of complex facts, proffering instead the guiding motto for the natural philosopher, seek simplicity and distrust it. In a similar vein, Charles Sanders Peirce argued that if we ignore the interdependence of all things and consider each thing for itself, then the general will correspond to no object. If, however, we accept that any particular is dependent on what lies beyond its immediate limits, then we discern that the perpetually abiding entirety of that thing's generic being must be appraised constantly from the viewpoint of the changeable, transitory, and evanescent nature of the idiosyncratic. This benchmark can be applied to the Kabbalistic construal of being and infinity. If we are to speak of an essence of Ein Sof, which is the Kabbalistic term for the infinite, literally means without limit, then it can be ascertained only from the vantage point of the inessential. Ein Sof is the being that is nothing, not because it is emptied of being, but because as the interdependence of all being, it is the delimitation of the limitless, the withholding that makes possible the bestowal of beingness from the being that is beyond the antinomical distinction between being and non-being. Consequently, any appeal to fixed meaning must be adduced from the fluctuating nature of historical contingencies. The variation of the invariable facilitates the continuity of the discontinuity. So having established the hermeneutical scaffolding of my argument, I will now offer some general observations that will be meticulously anchored by textual examples in the written work, but I'll spare you some of those meticulous details. Because in good Taoist fashion, I have compassion on the 10,000 beings. Concerning the Kabbalistic infinity, we can say that it is the one that is concurrently one and not one. The same that is the same and not the same. A paradox that is a facet of what I call the polyontological metaontology of Ein Sof. Now, this admittedly arresting and dense term, polyontological metaontology, denotes that the infinite nothingness is constituted by the miscellaneous appearances of the many rather than by the absorption of the many in a totalizing unity of the one. That is, the collapse of all conceptual disparities in the indistinction described famously by Hegel as the night in which all cows are black. In considering, come back to this. Okay, finally come back to the next text. In considering the relationship of Ein Sof to all other existing entities, we should not speak Neoplatonically of a transition from the self-same identity of the unitary ground in which all beings are identical to the diversified realm of multiplicity, insofar as the oneness of that ground is a one that is not one for the Kabbalists. That is, a one whose oneness is multifarious. Now, to underscore that distinction, I cited here a passage from Pseudo-Dionysius, the Arabagite. And you can see it on the screen. Since God is beyond beingly being, and as being is given to beings and brings forth the totality of beings, that one being is said to be multiplied by the bringing forth of all beings out of itself. It abides, not less than itself, one in its manifoldness, unified in its procession, full in its difference. Now, assuredly, Kabbalists would concur that all things come forth from Ein Sof in the way that Pseudo-Dionysius is saying all things are coming forth from the one. But the term polyontology, which, by the way, I borrow from, I had a very close friend who sadly died from pancreatic cancer many years ago, David Leahy. Maybe some of you know of his work. If not, you should look him up. An extraordinary philosopher. But so I borrow the term polyontology from Leahy. I want to give him credit. But how do I use the term? For me, it conveys more than that the one becomes manifold by virtue of generating the plurality of beings from itself. To be differentiated in a unified way signifies that the singularity of the infinite is such that it is constituted by the many. And therefore, it is not accurate to say, I wish this would just stay on, that it does not participate in the totality of the particulars, so that it remains, again in the language of Pseudo-Dionysius, indivisible in those which are divisible in a unity to itself and simply and unmixed in the many. Neither the model of unity and multiplicity nor that of multiplicity and unity is sufficient to delineate the hypernoetic space of the middle, where these distinctions are insufficient to capture the paradox of identity and difference that pertains to the non-dual diversity of the diverse non-duality of infinity that has informed Kabbalistic theosophy in earnest since the 12th and 13th centuries. Now, one of the more lucid formulations of what I'm trying to communicate can be found in the language developed by the masters of the Chabad-Lubavitch dynasty, which commenced in the 18th century and extended to the final decade of the 20th century, when the seventh Rebbe or master, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, passed away in 1994. Now, parenthetically, I have to say, at the current state of things, this chapter stands at 208 pages, or 6,000 words. So obviously, what I'm presenting here is absurdly inadequate. But I am basing the comments, inadequate as they are, on two of these masters. The second one, Dov Ber Shneur, 1773 to 1827, and the fifth, Sholem Dov Ber Schneerson, 1860 to 1920. According to the former, the contemplation of the universal, the Hebrew hitbonenut derech klal, that's his expression, runs the risk of being a false or vain form of conjunction, the very opposite of a genuine conjunction, and I'm translating the term dveikut as conjunction, which is a divine ecstasy. Okay, so the genuine sense of conjunction to the infinite or to the essence is what he calls divine ecstasy. But contemplation of the universal can be a false or vain form of that conjunction. Why? Because contemplating the universal can morph into worshiping oneself and not worshiping God. This is an extraordinarily interesting idea, which needs to be unpacked properly, and I can't do that here. But because you wouldn't expect that, you would expect that contemplation of the universal will bring one to a point of forsaking the ego and the isolated sense of self. But apparently he thought it achieved just the opposite. By contrast, contemplation of the particular, hitbonenut derech prat, if you focus on the particulars, that means finding the vastness of infinity in the condensation of the infinitesimal, or beholding eternity in every grain of sand, according to Dylan's paraphrase of Blake, inculcates the humility and modesty necessary to attain the essential annihilation, bitul atzmi, that results in one becoming an actual nothing, ayin mamash. So the goal is to become actually nothing, and the way to achieve it is by contemplating the particularities and not the general. And that works because the notion of infinitivity, or the essence, is constituted precisely by those particularities, which was the point I was trying to make previously. Okay, so there's more to say about this, but I'm going to skip. Now, we can also express this in quantum language, and I'm particularly drawing here on the work of David Bohm. And if we apply his language, we could say about the Ein Sof, the Kabbalistic infinite, that it signifies the coherent but never static whole that proliferates infinite diversification. The implicate order of consciousness, that's Bohm's language, explicitly materialized in the incessant process of the particulars unfolding into the whole, and the whole enfolding back into the particulars. Hence, each being, which we experience in our everydayness as individual and separate at a deeper level, at the level of the invisible, hidden variables underpinning empirically visible phenomena, is enmeshed in the interconnectedness of an ever-evolving aggregate. That is, an aggregate that defies the principle of the substantive indiscernibility of identicals, whereby the whole is constituted by the properties of the parts, and the parts are constituted by the properties of the whole. From that vantage point, the entanglement secures the disentanglement, and the non-locality of the indivisible wholeness ensures the appearance of localized centers of energy within the plasmic collectivity. Extrapolating further, we can deduce that the totality of being itself is constituted by non-being, insofar as the whole qua whole must always go beyond the whole, and the givenness of what is given must always involve what is ungiven. A negative holism, one could say, that presumes the absence of presence at the vortex of every presence of absence. Okay, so we can express this also in terms of Whitehead. Coming back to Whitehead, and in this quote from Whitehead, he pays particular attention to the temporal underpinning of the hermeneutical principle I just shared with you. So in Process and Reality, he writes, in the inescapable flux, there is something that abides. In the overwhelming permanence, there is an element that escapes into flux. Permanence can be snatched only out of flux, and the passing moment can find its adequate intensity only in its submission to permanence. Those who would disjoin the two elements can find no interpretation of patent facts. Now, I should just say briefly, again, kind of anecdotally here, that in the course of decades of teaching, whenever I would do the comparative mysticism course, I would say that the value of a comparative approach presumes a similarity, but not being disrespectful of dissimilarity. And I would say to the students, it's only by digging into the soil of one tradition that one inevitably will find the pathway that leads to other traditions. So the comparative approach shouldn't be flying overhead looking down, but it should be digging down and from the ground and going up. Okay, so I'm going to skip a little bit here, which I have more to say about the study of mysticism and religion, and I want to get more closer to our topic. Okay, so I begin the book on Apophasis and Infinity, primarily in Jewish sources, with a prelude that examines the lingering traces of apophaticism in some contemporary accounts of the limits of language and the commutability of the incommutable, themes that overlap with mathematical and scientific theorizing on the nature of infinitude. Presumably, the methodology to be elicited from these disciplines dictates that one can make sense of complicated things by breaking them into simpler things. However, the model of fragmentation is itself potentially indeterminable, as the fragment is always subject to further fragmentation. And thus the process of analytic disintegration raises a theoretical question if it is possible for there to be an integration such that the immeasurable can be measured. Now, as Peirce notoriously put it when he was evaluating whether a continuous line of the ostensibly non-relational real numbers is more than the sum of its parts. You see it on the screen. Breaking grains of sand more and more will only make the sand more broken. It will not weld the grains into unbroken continuity. Taking into account the infinite series of abnumerable multitudes, continuity, Peirce argued, consists of the relation of the parts of an unbroken space or time. And hence we can speak of a continuum where it is continuous and unbroken, but that contains no definite parts. Insofar as the concatenated system of points entails this true continuum, whose possibilities of determination no multitude of individuals can exhaust, the spirit of what he calls synchism implied thereby leads logically to the notion of infinity as the inexplicable explanation of all phenomena. And the principle of the excluded middle is suspended, since the point of it as an indivisible place is a mere possibility without any actual existence. That's all Peirce. Now, from Peirce, we may infer that the brokenness is innate to and not derivative from the continuous coming to be of the multitudinous oneness of the infinite. And this, again, has direct relevance to the way I'm trying to cast the Kabbalistic infinite. Hence, the brokenness cannot be broken without repudiating the very brokenness that is the unbroken nothingness of being. Analogously, and this is the next text, the incognizability of that one does, quote, not admit a sharp sundering of phenomenon from substrates. That which underlies a phenomenon and determines it thereby is itself in a measure a phenomenon. So grappling with the inscrutability of infinity opens the path to the seemingly unsettling wisdom that beneath the surface lies more surface. A gnosis that undermines the noematic distinction between appearance and reality, since there is no reality apart from what is imagined to be real. Stubbornly we lay claim to the sentient primacy of the sense of beingness. Who would stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue in New York City and test the facticity of the oncoming traffic? But being may be nothing but the being of dissemblance, behind which there is nothing but the dissemblance of being. Kabbalistic speculation on infinity demonstrates an appreciation for this epistemic platitude and the attendant insinuation that there is no truth without the semblance of untruth, no formation of the formless that is not a deformation, no revelation of the concealed without a concealment of the revealed, no way to depict what is beyond depiction but through the veil of metaphoricity, no seeing of the faces but through the facade of a face. Unconcealment on this score is not a disrobing of naked truth, but the disposing of the vestment in which truth is attired. A mask of untruth through which truth is unmasked. To speak of Ein Sof, accordingly, is to speak of the mystery at the highest figuration of truth. That is always also a disfiguration. And uncovering that is a recovering. In this matter, as I've argued in a previous publication, Kabbalists would concur with Heidegger that a mystery is not known in its power of veiling, that a mystery that is not known in its power of veiling is no mystery. On these grounds, we can propose that infinity is the mystery that reveals nothing, but that there is no mystery to reveal, a mystery exposed in the hiddenness of its exposure. Now, it seems applying all that we have said up to this point and turning the focus more specifically on the mathematical and scientific side of things, we could say that an infinite quantity perseveres as the same infinite quantity, whether a finite quantity, no matter how great, is subtracted or added to it. Hence, there is no terminus to any numerical sequence that we might contrive conceptually, since one can keep deducting or appending another number, and even between numbers there is a limitless number of divisions or fractions. Ultimately, the sole calculus that is feasible to calculate the incalculable can be delineated mathematically as what Hermann Weyl called the opposing weights of +1 and -1. The immutability of infinity's mutability on this account can be rendered holistically by the rudimentary formula 1 plus 0 equals 1. That is, adding 0 to 1 does not alter the nature of the 1 and its imperviousness to a many that would disrupt the interclusive consciousness of the manifold oneness. A calculus whose differential is determined by the oscillation between disparate poles such that the infinitely lowest number must be charted as 1 minus 1 plus 1, and correspondingly the infinitely highest number as 1 plus 1 minus 1. So it's 1 minus 1 plus 1 on one end and 1 plus 1 minus 1 on the other end, engenders an undulation that facilitates the discernment that an actual infinity will be made up of a potentially infinite number of infinities. This may be diagrammed as well as 1 divided by 0 equals infinity. Which is to say, if we divide 1 by 0, the result is the undefined sum of 0, a nothingness so large that it becomes the everythingness of infinity. From this perspective, the vacuity of 0 and the effusiveness of infinity can both be tallied as the enumeration situated at the boundary of enumeration, the actually non-existent that is real as imaginary and imaginary as real. Okay, so just kind of summarizing what I've done up to this point, and as you could see, I've actually been skipping quite a bit. What I tried to do in the introduction to the monograph is to provide a theoretical template by and through which the analysis of specific texts can be assessed. And the two subjects, infinity and apophasis, intersect at the vanishing point where the human mind reaches its limit by confronting the limitlessness that can be described only as indescribable. This was cited by Charles. Probing the philosophical implications of these impenetrable but inexorable subjects yields the paradoxical supposition that thought is entangled in the thorny project of having to think the unthinkable, that is, to contemplate the more that is always less than it is capable of contemplating. We are here reminded that in his positive philosophy, Schelling had argued for the need to turn attention away from the universality of logical structures to the singularities of historical events in an effort to ruminate over what is before rumination, to expose reason to what is beyond reason. Notwithstanding the far-reaching repercussions of this shift in orientation, it is legitimate to pose the question if it is not mandatory that every surpassing of reason is ipso facto an exercise of reason. Thus, from the realization that in Heidegger's articulation the essence of thinking is something other than thinking, there follows the equally perplexing dilemma that extending thought to what cannot be thought is itself a mode of thought, in the same way that extending speech to what cannot be spoken is itself a gesture of speech. That this is a topic about which I have written extensively in the course of many years, and to which I now return yet again, attests to the fact that to speak of the bounded openness of the nothing of infinity is a far greater challenge than to have nothing of which to speak. And this is something that I think Charles quoted. If the sensation of speech is the goal of the mystical path that culminates in cogitating the nature of infinity beyond comprehension and linguistification, then muteness would be the appropriate response. But in fact, the way of the mystic demands the much more difficult task of speaking the unspeakable. And Derrida succinctly encapsulated the point in the statement, to speak in order to say nothing is not to speak. Above all, it is not to speak to no one. So there's more to say here, and there are a couple of passages from Pseudo-Dionysius. I'm going to skip them. But I do want to make this point, because I invoke our fearless leader, Professor Stang, on this point. So I don't want to skip that part. But I had just made the point. we can elicit from Pseudo-Dionysius a kind of intermingling of the apophatic and the cataphatic. And particularly, I referenced here the first chapter in his Mystical Theology, where he describes the Trinity as beyond being, beyond divinity, beyond goodness. But then he implores implores the Trinity to guide Christians, quote, to the mystical summits more than unknown, where the mysteries of theology, quote, lie hidden in the darkness beyond light of the hidden mystical silence. But what does it mean to speak of knowing what is more than unknown? Is there an unknowability that can be known only by unknowing that knows less and therefore more than the unknowable? Now, this seems to me what Dionysius was referring to in the divine names when he spoke of the unknowing of the beyond beingness itself, beyond logos, intellect and being, a knowledge beyond being. I think I did have this one. Beyond being. Now, the agnosis, which came up previously, here it's agnosis in the sense of unknowing, beyond being, entails a twofold ignorance of the apophasis, or the unknowing of the unknowing. And here's where I refer to a comment made by Charles. With respect to the Dionysian apophatic anthropology, that's his language, the self that unites with the unknown God must itself become unknown, and thus, you see the quote, the eros or love for God propels the self to stretch to the point that it splits in two, in ecstasy, and thereby opens itself to the indwelling of the unknown God as Christ. So if I'm reading you correctly, it seems that in the doubling of identity, facilitated by the authorial practice of writing under a pseudonym, as the appropriate form to communicate the ecstatic devotion to attaining this deifying union, the apophatic does give way to the cataphatic, and the unknown Father dwells in the unknown self as the knowable Son. Alluding to this intermingling of apophatic silence and cataphatic praise, Dionysius remarked in the Divine Names that the theologians celebrate God as nameless and in accordance with all names. A passage that has been discussed by any number of scholars. Now, this idea is reinforced exegetically by Dionysius by the depiction of Jesus in Philippians 2:9. Therefore God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name. And by the account of Christ's enthronement in Ephesians 1:21, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion and above every name that is named, not only is this in this age, but also in that which is to come. Now, verily, a name that is above all names is perforce nameless, but it is a name nonetheless. And that's the point. So this particular example exemplifies the larger philosophical point that apophasis must be construed as a verbal act, a language of unsaying in the fecund language of Michael Sells. Or in Derrida's formulation, a declaration, an explanation, a statement, a voiceless voice. In some sense, negative, well, there was one other quote. To speak, this is from Derrida, to speak to the other, to say something, to affirm or to confirm by speech at the extreme limit, that it is necessary to be silent, and to be silent about what one cannot speak of. Even if I decide to be silent, even if I decide to praise nothing, not to commit myself to saying anything, that would confirm once again the destination of speech and the destination to speech. This silence still remains a modality of speech. Okay, so that, again, that is the key point. Silence still remains a modality of speech. And therein lies the key to the distinction I've drawn in many publications between the reticence of not speaking and the retraction of speaking not. Now I'm going to even shorten my presentation more because the hour is late and I've said enough unsaid or enough said, depending on your point of view. So I had more of a Derrida and Heidegger. We'll let that go. But let me just come then to the end. Very interesting passage of Levinas, with which I'd like to end. So implicitly responding to the Pauline criticism of the Pharisaic affirmation of the letter and disregard of the spirit, a bias that I'm sure you're all familiar with, that it has had a lasting impact on the caricature of the Jew in the history of Christian theology and biblical hermeneutics. Levinas noted that the law in Judaism points to what lies beyond itself. Whatever our mistrust towards the letter and our thirst for the spirit may be, monotheistic humanity is a humanity of the book. Scriptural tradition provides the trace of a beyond of this very tradition. So the beyond to which Levinas refers is, of course, the transcendence of God, what he calls the transcendence of God, or as he describes it in the second citation, the way of the absolute, that is foreign to cognition, that which is too great for the measure of finitude of presence, revelation, order, and being, and which consequently, as neither being nor non-being, is the excluded third party of the beyond of being and non-being, perhaps also expressed by the word God. Translating the metaontological metaphysics into a traditional vocabulary, the Levinasian face, which defies specularization or figurative representation, is signified by the ineffable name, Yahweh, Yud-He Vav-He, which according to the rabbinic ritual is routinely pronounced by the epithet Adonai, my Lord. Prima facie it would seem that in this matter Levinas embraced an idea essential to the Kabbalah. The most sacred of God's names is concomitantly concealed and revealed, indeed concealed in its revelation and revealed in its concealment. Moreover, if we presume that the name is representative of language more generally, then one can deduce from the liturgical custom not to utter the tetragrammaton as it is written, the philosophical axiom that language as such is always paired with the speechlessness that propagates but yet surpasses it. In this regard, the essence of language consists of the continual abandonment of what is said. Now I come to the end. The linguistic skepticism at play here mandates that the verbal act of saying renders every said unsaid, and thus the poetic potency of speech can be uncovered only to the extent that the secret is obscured in its exposure. The naming of the infinite in the apophatic tradition is not akin to the commonplace function of attributing a name to a particular person or to a given entity, because in the case of the former, the final veil to lift is the discernment that there is no final veil, beyond which there is a luminosity that can be completely unveiled. The pretense of unfurling a final veil is the veil of there being a final veil to unfurl. Expressed in a different terminological register, the face, which is disguised and divulged conjointly by the mask, is itself nothing but a mask of the face that mutually covers and uncovers the face of the mask. Analogously, every act of saying is an unsaying, an avowal that is ipso facto a disavowal. The withdrawal from speech does not follow sequentially from the cessation of speaking, rather occurs simultaneously as the mystery that is formulated as what remains incipient. Any statement that we can posit about affinity is synchronicity true and untrue, an insight that leads to the further conclusion that the superfluous expansion of the word is mediated through the diminutive constraint of the word. The maxim that guides the path of our thinking and the rhetoric commensurate to it as we explore the paradox of knowing the unknowable in its unknowability, tracing the footprints of what can appear only by disappearing in the disappearance of its appearance. Thank you.
CSWR.HDS.Harvard.edu, copyright 2025, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.